Hi, this is Mrs. Politsky, and these are your notes for Chapter 21, Section 3. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the 1970s and the presidencies of Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So take a look at number 1. What did President Johnson's administration do to cause inflation to rise? Well, President Johnson increased the deficit spending to fund the Vietnam War and his Great Society programs. Many of these programs were very costly, and anytime that you fight a war, it's also costly too. Number 2, what region provided much of the oil on which the United States depended upon? And that would be the Middle East and Africa. And you can kind of see in the charts here where we're getting some of that petroleum. Moving on. Number 3, why did OPEC members stop shipping petroleum to some countries in 1973? Well, OPEC stopped shipping because there was a war between Israel and its neighbors, and some of these nations, like the United States, had supported the Israelis in the war against the Arabs. And as a result, we had an embargo of oil that took place in the fall of 1973. Number 4, what did high prices for oil-based products mean for Americans? Well, it meant that we had less money to spend on other goods, which led to a recession. And when you couple a recession with unemployment, you might get something called stagflation. So what is a stagflation? A combination of inflation and a stagnating economy with high unemployment. And our country was socked right in the middle of that about 1973, 1974 through 1975. Number 6, what turned many Americans against detente? This was a policy that was implemented by Richard Nixon. And part of that was because the Soviets had been failing to uphold human rights that they had signed on to at the Helsinki Accords. And as a result, there was kind of a presidential debate in the election of 1976 where Gerald Ford actually admitted in a debate that this wasn't a problem. And as a result, many Americans kind of lost support for Gerald Ford. Number 7, what did American voters find appealing about Jimmy Carter? Well, Jimmy Carter was a very moral man, and he was an outsider to Washington. He had been the governor of Georgia, and people didn't see him as being tied into the Watergate event at all. All right, so in 1976, in the presidential election, we had our incumbent, Gerald Ford, who had been the unelected vice president of Richard Nixon, and eventually the president, and Jimmy Carter, a Democrat from Georgia. And many Americans were kind of resentful to Ford, and hence they voted for Jimmy Carter. So, number 8, what did Carter feel was the nation's most serious problem? He believed it was our dependence on foreign oil. And as a result, there were a lot of people that were calling for greater controls on oil, perhaps more drilling here in the United States. But he understood that we had an energy issue going on. Who did Carter appoint as the first African-American ambassador to the United Nations? A man named Andrew Young. Andrew Young was a friend of Martin Luther King Jr. and would represent the United States at the UN for many years to come. Number 10, what did President Carter do to remove a major symbol of U.S. interventionism in Latin America? And he agreed to give back control of the Panama Canal to the Panamanian people. He signed on to this in the late 1970s. The plan was not to have this happen until about the end of the 1990s. And it did happen. The United States handed over control, and we pulled up our stakes in Panama. In the time since, many of the warehouses along the canal have been rented out by other nations. Matter of fact, the people of Panama have opened up another set of gates or locks on the canal to accommodate bigger ships. Number 11. How did President Carter react to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979? Jimmy Carter, using his wisdom for the time, decided that we were going to impose a grain embargo, and hence U.S. farmers were not going to, be able to sell their grain to the Soviet Union. And he also decided that U.S. athletes would not participate in the Summer Olympic Games, which were going to be held in Moscow. Now, most people here in this country probably recognized the Olympics for the fact that we didn't participate, but on a local level, the grain embargo really hurt the Midwest, and it really devastated a lot of Midwestern farmers, causing some to go into bankruptcy. Number 12. What was Carter's greatest foreign policy triumph? And that was the signing of the Camp David Accords, which was a peace agreement between the nations of Israel and Egypt. Anwar Sadat, who was the president of Egypt, and Menachem Begin, who was the president of Israel, had been fighting a series of wars over the years, kind of fighting over the borders and the existence of Israel in itself. And as a result, these two nations have been at peace since the signing of this back in 1978. Number 13. Who replaced the Shah of Iran as the leader of Iran after the country was declared an Islamic Republic? And this kind of brought about a series of revolutions that took place in Iran in the late 1970s, starting in 1979. The man who would take over would be a guy named Ayatollah Khomeini. Khomeini had been kind of kicked out of Iran many years ago, and he had been sending audio recordings of his sermons, if you want to call it that, to the people of Iran, and many of them found great inspiration in that. During the course of this revolution, eventually we had some Americans that were taken hostage at our American embassy. So what was the result of an American attempt to rescue the hostages being held in Iran? And unfortunately, this event was a major fiasco. The Ayatollah had released many of the minorities and the women kind of in the early days of this crisis, but he kept the remaining men, and about shortly a year after they had been captured, they sent in a rescue mission, and what ends up happening is these helicopters crash at a rendezvous point. So the rescue mission failed when the mission's helicopters crashed, killing 8 servicemen. It was a very humiliating event. All right. All right, these are our notes for today, and you have a couple of links that you can watch for video about some of the things that we have talked about.